This week we're going to be looking at inclusive classroom practice, and this is in preparation for your first task. Before we get started this week, pause the recording and have a go at these questions because they'll help bring you back into mind of what you looked at last week. This week we're going to be thinking about differentiated instruction. We'll be looking at some theoretical perspectives, and you can read further about that. Then we'll look at some inclusive practice examples and consider the issues that have arisen from those. Some of these examples come from research work that I've been doing in looking at the work that inclusive practitioners do and really seeing some remarkable work these teachers are doing. And it's really a joy to share it with you. So let's think about what differentiated instruction is. Carol Tomlinson is one of the world's experts in this field, and so if you find material written by her, it would be good to have a good look at it. She talks about here this responsibility, well, it's actually Laparo and Pianta, but it was really underlining the work that she's been thinking about, that it's the responsibility of schools to adjust to the developmental needs. And as I'll talk about in another lecture, some countries see this differently, and this can be an issue where it's a cultural difference, but certainly in Australia, it's a recognised responsibility of schools to make the adjustments, and it's not up to the children to fit in. That's an important consideration in differentiated instruction. Unfortunately, there are reports, and these are fairly consistent in some of the government documents, reports, inquiries and so on, that parents report that schools refuse to enrol students or seek to remove them based on their claimed inability to meet their needs. But this is against the practice of the Disability Discrimination Act, and we'll be looking at that more after you've had the first assignment. So differentiated instruction can be, you can change that by the presentation of the content, the process or the product. So if you're thinking about the content, what's to be covered, the process, how they're going to go about doing it, and the product, what will be the outcomes of that learning. How is it that the student's going to be able to show what they know or can do as a result of instruction? So when you're looking at the lesson design for task 1, have a think about what's in the content, what's the process and what's the product. How are these 3 different aspects of the lesson being altered? So you can be thinking about the differentiation of the curriculum, the teaching methods, the resources, the learning activities, and then the assessment. So those aspects are important in differentiating instruction. And what you're doing is really trying to maximise the students' learning opportunities. Still, the learning is up to them. In the end, it's always up to us what we learn and how we learn it. But it is the opportunity of the teacher to make that variety there so that the students have the best opportunity they can. I promised a theoretical perspective, so let's have a look at this one. This is just a bit of an overview of some of the learning theorists that have been influential in education theory. Vygotsky has had a sort of starring role. He's a bit of a hero of many people, and it's an important theory that he was working on, a Russian theorist. I think one of the theorists that is often overlooked perhaps has been Brunner, and I'm going to combine those two to consider the implications for inclusive practice. So Vygotsky is famous for the zone of proximal development, and you can read there that that's a translation clearly because he wrote in Russian. And what we have here is this distance between the actual developmental level of the child and what they can do by themselves, what they can't do at all, and then what they can do with the help of another. So what we need to work out is what's the appropriate level of difficulty, and then what's the teacher's role in all of this. And I really love this theory because it really emphasises that teachers are important. They really, really are. Teachers make a big difference. So this is a fairly common diagram that you'll see visualising the zone. So presuming that learning is a linear trajectory, which is contentious, but there are things you can do all by yourself, things that you're going to need help with, and things that it doesn't matter how much support you get, you can't do it yet. One of the things we need to ask ourselves though is, where is the zone? Now what we have had a sense of, particularly in mathematics, is that you can't do certain things until you have achieved success at others. So for example, often it is thought that you can't do higher level mathematics until you've done simple arithmetic, you've acquired basic number concepts. And even when I say higher mathematics, that presumes a hierarchy. Now we're challenging that in some of the research we're doing. And I want to show you a video. This is a video of my daughter doing homework. She has Down syndrome, and she, at the point of this video, this is when she was in about year 8, she wouldn't have been reliably able to add 2 single-digit numbers. However, her teacher decided that she would teach her percentages, and this is her homework. In this next video, I want you to listen carefully for the role of the tutor. Now, in this video, Ruth is learning to do algebra, and she's been doing it for a couple of lessons. And you can listen to the questions that are helping her to be able to do this work, which she cannot do yet by herself, but she's in the zone here. Here she's in the zone of proximal development. So with the support of a teacher, she can complete the work. You'll also notice at the end where I encourage her to do the simple calculation of 25 plus 2 without a calculator, how terribly difficult it is for her to do. She gets there in the end, but it is not an easy process. So the calculator is there. She's using that to support her learning, and we'll talk more about that in the future. So in applying Vygotsky, there's some suggestions from McInerny and McInerny. It's a text on education theory. Teachers give students the access to tools to support their thinking and use modelling. Now, tools in a Vygotskian sense is not necessarily a physical object like a hammer. It's anything that is there to support a learner. So it might be a diagram, it might be a vocabulary list, it could be a photograph, it could be a physical object. By providing opportunity for dialogue and group learning, this enables people to be in that zone. Vygotsky was very much interested in the use of language to support learning, and so learning sitting by yourself in quiet single desks wouldn't have been anything that Vygotsky would have supported. Now, Vygotsky's work has been considered about scaffolding, and we'll talk about Bruner's role in that later on. But the idea is that an adult teacher or a more competent learner uses supports to support that student. And when you're thinking about task one, think about how you'll be using that lesson to support learners. And then teachers provide authentic teaching and learning experiences so that there's not a big difficulty for them to apply it in other contexts. Now let's have a look at Brunner. Brunner's was a very long-lived gentleman who did a lot of work. He's from the United States and did a lot of work around education theory. So in his book, The Process of Education, he talked about this hypothesis that you can teach any subject effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. Now, he was talking about a school-age child, to put that in context. Now, it's a bold statement, but I want to introduce you to the idea about the 3-minute thesis, which was founded in the EDUC, but it's now worldwide. Here, people put a thesis, so usually a doctoral thesis, into 3 minutes. So work that they've spent 3 years doing, they're at the cutting edge of knowledge in their field, they put it into 3 minutes and explain it to people who know nothing about their field. It's a really interesting competition, so you can watch some of those. They're very entertaining. So think about it now from your perspective. Choose a topic you know well, and I encourage you to pause and do this. I think it's quite informative. Try explaining it to a student in Year 6. So think about a kid who's in primary school, but at the upper end of primary school, so getting to be a bit sophisticated in their thinking and learning. Then explain it to a 6-year-old, that same topic. Can you do it? Have a go. So let's think about Brunner's contributions. He introduced the term scaffolding. It's often attributed to Vygotsky. The ideas are very similar, but the term is Brunner's. And I'll leave you to pause it and read that, because it talks about what's involved in this scaffolding. Another aspect is this spiral curriculum. The idea, if you go back to that 3-minute thesis idea where you started with the Year 6 student and then the 6-year-old, think about it the other way. As we're learning, and we begin as babies knowing very little indeed, but gradually we go to understand more and more and more about the world. And then the more we know, the more we're able to connect in and keep moving and developing. So we can begin with some ideas that we learn as young children. They become increasingly sophisticated. So that's the spiral curriculum. And you can have a think about it through this diagram here. The idea that we gradually build up in any particular topic area. And then he talked about 3 modes of representation in thinking. So I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. The first one is an active, action-based, so being able to learn by doing. And this is any new learning. This is a bit different to Piaget, that he believed that you moved through different stages, and once you'd gone past concrete operations, you could think formally. Well, more recent work has determined that at whatever age we're at, we need to think concretely when we're learning something new. Iconic is where we can work on images, and symbolic is language-based. So those three work together. So I've got a picture of tatting. I was trying very hard to learn how to tat based on diagrams in a book, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do if you're trying to learn a skill, and it's certainly much easier to be shown. Yes, you can look at pictures, yes, you can read about it, but being able to see it in action helps. So all three work together. So choose a learning area and give examples of each. Now you might like to think about this in terms of the task that you're doing for task 1, embellishing that lesson plan, making sure there's active bits in there, that there's images, that there's... I want to introduce to you the concept of year level appropriate curriculum. This is where we teach children based on their year level of their current enrolment. So if they're in year 7, you begin with the curriculum for year 7 and adjust it as needed. Now this is a different practice to what had been considered to be the approach we should take in recent times. So in the past, what had been thought of was that we assess learners and we find out where they are on the established learning trajectory, which was considered to be linear and hierarchical. Because of what we've been talking about previously around theoretical perspectives, we get to understand that that's a contentious view. And so the other problem is that learners can be stuck. They can end up being taught the same material over and over and over again, and they don't get a chance to succeed at other topic areas. So a different approach is to adjust the year level for the curriculum that they are studying. So if they're in year 7, as I said, they do the year 7 curriculum. Now, my colleague Jill Cheeseman, rather aptly named, calls these kids Swiss cheese learners. So learners who might have some gaps in their previous background for whatever reason are given this opportunity to keep moving, keep learning, and then sometimes they get the chance to fill the gaps as they go along. And this is one of the advantages of the spiral curriculum. So as we move through, we can support learners through perhaps building concepts that they have yet to acquire. To do this, we need to think about a differentiated curriculum. So how do we support all learners? Now I'm going to take some notes here from the reference that you can see below, which is about supporting gifted learners, because we're not always considering learners who are behind or learners who have yet to acquire some concepts. We're also considering learners who have got those concepts and they need some challenge. So what are the recommendations? Well, a high quality curriculum and instruction, of course, is important for everybody. We need to clearly specify what we want learners to learn. What do we want them to know? What's the underlying most important thing? And that's a really critical thing to communicate to other people, such as teacher aides who might also be working in the classroom. We need to know what students need to know, understand and are able to do as a result of instruction. And if we think about those three, then those three are about things that you might consider for your task 1. Okay, the next one is engagement with the essential questions of the discipline, and this becomes a really important thing where people who are teaching a particular area really need to know their discipline well. So if you're a science teacher teaching in the primary school, being aware of what are the big things that people are involved in, the ways that they're grappling with ideas, that becomes a really important thing for you to know, so that you can then engage students in your class with those. And gifted learners in particular who are looking for challenge really respond to opportunities to get involved with current thinking in the discipline. Yeah, they also need to understand the nature of the discipline. So in mathematics, for example, that's a field I understand well, the challenge is not about learning off techniques. The challenge here is about how you justify the solution of problems. So you need to give students the opportunity to solve problems and then justify their solutions, which is fundamentally about proof, which is what separates mathematics from other disciplines. And if you'd be more familiar with other areas perhaps, and understanding the nature of those disciplines is really something we need to communicate to students. They need to have an engaging learning process, and critically important for gifted learners, but of course it's important for everybody. The research would suggest that gifted learners in particular enjoy a focus on a product, challenging problem solving and being able to create products, and that can be used for all learners. Gifted learners in particular enjoy that development of self-awareness and reflection, being able to think about how they're learning. And if we make it personally and culturally relevant, that's helpful for those students, but all of these things are just good teaching practice. Being responsive to learning needs is the final one. So it's not just about teaching to the middle, put it out there, and good luck to whoever's waiting to learn. It's more about thinking about our learners. So that's the basis of the differentiated curriculum, where we begin with the year level content and we think about how we're going to adjust that for other learners. I'm now going to tell you a story based on some research that I did in primary classrooms, and this was around how teachers included students with Down syndrome in mathematics lessons, but the underlying principles are not necessarily about mathematics. It's more about how students were included. So this is a particular teacher. Her name is Kerry, and she was a participant in our research, and this was her Year 3-4 composite classroom. There's a student with Down syndrome in the room, and when I put my bags down at the back of the room, I noticed there was a display board with children doing their work, and one of the students in the pictures had Down syndrome. Now, you wouldn't notice it. It wouldn't have been any great difference to any of the other children. That's the beauty of inclusive practice. They're in the midst of it, doing what the other students are doing, but not necessarily the same way. The lesson began with the children sitting on the carpet, and the teacher is sitting there, and she's got some blocks in her hand, and she's talking to the students about what she wants them to do. It's a lesson on volume, and she was building up the idea that a volume of a prism is the area of the base times the height. So she's going to give them 5 blocks to build a base of their own interest. And here's our student. She's got her little cubes just like the other kids. Now, just as the children were finishing that part, they were all asked to go and get their books, and the student was asked to get her iPad. And I thought that that was the end of the lesson for her, that she'd be given some games or some other activity while the other kids went on and did the work in their books. But that wasn't the case. And this was a video clip where the student was using her blocks here, and she was dragging from the side little diagrams of the cubes. And I asked the teacher afterwards, well, tell me about your choice here. And she said, well, I knew that I wanted the children to record a diagram of what they had made with their blocks. And the student with Down syndrome would have had trouble with her fine motor to be able to draw them. So the drawing wasn't the important bit, the diagram was. So then this teacher, very creative teacher, thought about what could she do instead. And she said, it's not really a drawing one, it's a place value app. But I thought that would be perfect. Now, to me, that was such a good example of a teacher seeing an educational need and thinking creatively about how that need could be met. So the teacher then had different ways of getting the students all to join in and do different things. Now, in this part of the lesson, these students are practicing their mental computation. This is a challenge for our learner with Down syndrome for reasons that I'll go into at another point if you're interested. But this student's work she was still at the point of needing to recognise what dice patterns were, for one thing. So the teacher was getting her to roll the die, call out the number, and then the teacher would give the operation. So it might be 2 times, the student would roll the number and call out 3, and the children would write that down in their books. Another example was where they were doing a lesson on probability, and in these bags were little counters, some green, some yellow. Someone had to count them. Who better than the student who's still learning to acquire that skill? So she's in the midst of hearing about probability, thinking about these ideas as the other children are using the language, and she's still getting the help in the particular area that she's working on. So that's that idea of filling the gaps as you go along. So keeping her moving, not going back to just counting small collections, but thinking about it in a new context. The other good thing I think about inclusive practice is you see these young boys here, and those students are learning what it is to be in a community where you have learners and members of that community who have different needs. Remembering in diverse practice, we all have needs, and learning how to get along with each other is an important part of socialising. So the teacher then, what she would do is she would keep her eye on the class. She had a student sitting near her, but she didn't have her just working one-on-one with her. She was sitting beside other students. The teacher would keep her eye around the room as she was going. So managing the class for her, she would circulate. She knew what the students were doing, but she would leave them to do their work as they were going. And then at different times she would sit down at the front and the children would bring their work to her. And our student with Down syndrome would line up to show her the work as well. So this is a different teacher in the project. Her name's Melanie, and she had a teacher aide working with her in the classroom sometimes. So this photo is where they're doing a catch-up in the first few minutes as the children were coming in and getting settled. Melanie was updating the teacher aide on the planning. She was communicating what the important ideas were and what the goals of the lesson were, the big ideas really, and also what her role would be, what her task as the teacher aide would be, and then what to do if things didn't work out as planned. We then see that she's sitting here beside the student with Down syndrome, but she's also in close catching position to help this student here and some of the others at the table. You'll notice that she's positioned herself off to the side. She doesn't block the student's view of what's going on in the classroom, and she's also able to withdraw and not give too much support. At different times, this teacher aide would work with other students as well, and sometimes when this student needed particular support, the class teacher would be the one to give that support. So what we've talked about in this lecture is around differentiated instruction. We've built it on theoretical perspectives, looking at Vygotsky and Bruner. And through the different thinking about it, I've been referring to task 1 and that lesson plan that's going to be embellished. So you might want to go back and have a look at the slide about differentiated instruction, where you're thinking about the different aspects of the lesson, particularly what's the content, how it's delivered, and how it's assessed. We've looked at some practical examples of how this is done in classrooms. A touch on working with learning support assistants, thinking about how inclusive practitioners manage the class, and also this idea of doing the same but not the same thing. So they're in the class and engaged, but there are alterations that are made, adjustments that are made. So I'd like you to think about what are the main points for you and what's challenging. And please be in touch, put questions if you have them on the discussion board, and let's keep the conversation going.